This week's Parsha is Parashat Mishpatim, and what I'd like to do is to examine the opening section, which is speaks about an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave. And from what I understand, I apologize in terms of the source sheet. I hope that at least the one that's posted now will be okay. The one that was sent out was a little bit unclear, or this is supposed to be a landscape format, and I think it came out as a portrait format. In any case, so what you have on the first page are the three sections in the Torah which speak about a Hebrew slave. So what I'd like to do on the opening section is our parsha. I would also like to point out that our parsha is the first parsha in the Torah, which is really what we would, actually it's not true, Parshat Bo is as well, but certainly in terms of being chock full of mitzvot, okay, this is Parshat Mishpatim, okay, and to a great extent, I think I spoke about this last year in the Shir, that whereas in last week's Parsha, there was the revelation at Mount Sinai, at the end of this Parsha, there is the covenant which is made with the Jewish people, and sandwiched in between is essentially the content of the covenant, which are all the mitzvot which are mentioned in our parsha. And one of the things which eventually I would like to speak about is why, in fact, do we start out with Eved Ivri? So I'm going to try to go through as much as I possibly can with the various halachot, and then try to give maybe a broader picture after we look at the various details. So without any further ado, if you have the first page, which has 3 columns, and we'll look at the first on the right, that's the opening section of our parsha. So it says the following: Ki tikneh eved ivri, sheish shanim ya'avod, uvashvi'it yeitzei lachofshi chinam. Okay, ki, which is either if or when you acquire, but let's say if. If you acquire a Hebrew slave, for 6 years he shall work, and in the 7th year he goes free, chinam, without payment. And here what I'm going to be looking at is the halachic, so to speak, pshat interpretation of the verses. We're going to be using Rashi. So the first thing which I want to point out is that Eved Ivri does not mean the slave of a Hebrew, but a slave who is a Hebrew, right? For those of you who paid attention when we spoke about the Hebrew midwives, okay, is it the midwives of the Hebrews or the midwives who are Hebrew? In this situation, it's clear that we're talking about a slave who is a Hebrew. Now, by the way, I also want to point out that using the term Ivri in many places in the Chumash is a pejorative term, and so that it would actually be appropriate to talk about an Eved Ivri as opposed to an Eved Yisraeli, because Israel expresses your grandeur. Okay, Ivri is something which is, as I said, a pejorative term. Now, it says if or when you acquire a Hebrew slave, and the question becomes, what's the background for the acquisition of this Hebrew slave? And Rashi, based on the Talmud, says that this section is speaking about, and if you look at the Rashi, it says, Ki tikneh miyad beitin, you acquired this slave from the beitin, from the court, shemecharuhu bignevato, who sold him as a result of his theft, Kamoshin Emar, as it says, Im ein lo v'nimkar bignevato, right? And this is actually a pasuk in chapter 22 in our parsha, chapter 22 too, which says that if somebody steals and they're not able to pay back what they've stolen. So then they are sold for their theft as a way of paying back the person whose object was stolen. So this is Rashi saying this is the context of our section. We're talking about someone who was sold by the court, who stole, who wasn't able to pay back. And so this section is the law of what's called nimkar b'gnevato, somebody who's sold as a result of his theft. And what's the law? The law is that when this type of person is sold, he's sold for a period of 6 years. In the 7th year, he is sent free. And a number of commentaries, which I didn't prove, say that don't confuse this with the sabbatical year. It has nothing to do with the sabbatical year. Notice the 7th year is not the sabbatical year. It's his sabbatical year, right? So in other words, you count 7 years from the time that he is sold. Now, when it says he goes free, so gratis, the point which is being made is that he does not buy his freedom. Okay, he automatically will go free. Now let's look at the next verse. Im begapo yavo, begapo yetze, im bal ishahu, b'yatza'a ishto imo, which means that if he came in begapo, and again, if you look at Rashi, so Rashi says, in begapo yavo, shelo married, v'lashon begapo biknafo. The language bikapo means with the corner of his garment. Shelo ba ela kamot shehu, that he only came in as he is, yichidi, alone, betoch levusho, in his garment, bekanaf bigdo, in the corners of his garment. Okay, now there are other commentaries who want to say begapo means bigufo, with his body. But whichever one it is, the Torah is emphasizing this idea that if he came in alone, he leaves alone. If he was married, he leaves with his wife. Okay? Now, Rashi then, if you go, so if you look at the continuation of the Rashi says, Begapo yetze, magid, this teaches us, Shimlo haya nasui mitchila, if he wasn't married at the outset, meaning when he became the slave, Rabo moser lo shivcha knaanit, the master cannot give him a Canaanite servant, laholid mimenu avadim, to bear, right, children who will be slaves. The imbali shahu Yisraelit, but if he's somebody who was married to a Jewish woman when he first entered, the Yatzai Shtoimo, so then Rashi says, V'chi mi hichnisa shetetzei, who brought her in that she should go out? Ella, Magida Katuv, the text teaches us, tells us, Shakone Evet Ivri, one who acquires a Hebrew slave, or let's say servant for the moment, Chayab bimzonot ishto banav, is obligated to feed his wife and his children. So, according to Rashi, what this verse is teaching me are two halachot. If this person was single when he was sold as a slave, the owner does not have the right to give him a Canaanite servant to bear children who will become the slaves of the owner. And the other halacha is if he came in, if he was married at the time, and here I'll maybe slightly amplify Rashi, the owner is actually obligated to take in his wife, and if he has children, and to provide them. Rashi says to feed them, but it's much more than feeding them. It's feeding them, clothing them, and housing them. And in fact, here I'll jump for 1 second to a comment which appears in the Ibn Ezra. Wait a second, let me just find it. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not the Ibn Ezra. It's the Ramban. On the last page, if you look at the second line on the Ramban towards the end where I have it highlighted, the Ramban says, "V'yatsa ishto imo v'hanir'eh beinai," would seem to be shehu, and I put in brackets ha'adon, which means the master, nichnas bimkom ha'ba'al, that the master enters in the place of the husband, which means that a husband is obligated to feed and to clothe and to house his wife. The master, in effect, takes over the obligations of a husband to his wife. He becomes the surrogate husband, with one major difference. Whereas the husband also has the obligation to have regular conjugal relations with his wife, that is not something which the master has any obligation, and certainly, I mean, certainly no obligation, and there's certainly no allowance for it. Okay, so I'll come back to this point later. So let's now look a little bit further. If you go back to chapter 21, verse 5, the first page, right? It says, "V'im amor yomar ha'eved," and if the servant will now say, "Ahavti et Adoni, et ishti ve'et banai, lo etzei chofshi." I love my wife. I love my master. I don't want to go out. And my children. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped a verse. This is very important. Go back to verse 4. Okay, so what do we say? If he's single, he goes out single. If he's married, the owner has to take in his wife, and when the time comes, she will go out with him. But then it says in verse 4, Im Adonav yitan lo isha, if the master will give him a wife, v'yalda lo banim o banot, and she will bear to him sons or daughters, ha'isha v'yiladeha tiyel adoneha, v'hu yetzei v'gapo. Then in that case, the woman and her children will be to the master, whereas he will go out alone. Okay, now, given everything that we've done, so what do we say? In a case where he's married, where the owner is taking in his wife and maybe even children and is providing for them, and if you think about it, that becomes a very, very heavy burden on the owner. So it's as if he has all these responsibilities, but he has no, if you will, benefits from it. So what we say is he does have one benefit. And what's the benefit? He has the right to give this servant a woman who will bear children, and those children and the woman will remain his even after the man leaves. And Rashi points out, and this is all based on the Talmud, and it's also logical, the woman who he's giving him can only be a woman who is, quote unquote, his possession. And the woman who's his possession is what is known as a Canaanite slave, or for our purposes, a non-Jewish slave. Which means that the owner who has a non-Jewish female slave can now give her to this man, essentially to be a breeder. Whatever children will be born will go after the mother and will have the status of being Canaanite slaves, and they will remain to the master when the time comes for the man himself to leave. Now, look at verse 5 now. What happens when the time comes for him to leave? The im amor yomar ha'eved, and if the slave will say, Ahavti et Adoni, et ishti ve'et banai, lo etzei chofshi. I love my master, I love my wife, I love my sons. I don't want to go free. Now, I want to point out who is the wife that he loves and who are the children that he loves, it's actually a woman who is not his wife and children who are not his children. Because as it says in the previous verse, if the master gives them a woman and she has children, they will remain the master's. So it really becomes fascinating that he says, but I love that woman, who in fact is really not his wife, and the children who are really not his children. Now I want to turn this a little bit on its head. The only time that the master can give him this Canaanite woman is if he's already married and perhaps even has children. So then it becomes very interesting, right? Because here he has an actual wife, and here he has this pseudo wife. And what seems to be is that he's saying, I love the woman, not his actual wife, but the other woman, and therefore I don't want to leave. And then what the Torah says is the following. Okay, there was a question. I'll just answer this quickly from Allison. How could they not be his children? Not his children, because in fact, this is not recognized as a marriage. And according to the halakha, whenever you have a relationship which is not recognized as a halachic marriage, I'm not talking about premarital sex now, but I'm talking about something which could never be recognized as a marriage. So as a result of that, the children go after the mother. And if the mother has the status of being a Canaanite woman, then in the end, the children follow the mother. In the same way that, for example, if you had a Jew, a relationship between a Jew, a male Jew, and a non-Jewish woman, then the children would follow the mother as opposed to the father. Okay, but I don't want to get into this whole discussion now because it'll take us a little bit far afield. Now, what I do want to get to is, but what happens if the slave says, but I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children, then what do? So then we're told in verse 6, then the master brings him to the God, and I'll say this right now, El Ha-Elohim, Rashi here comments, to the Beit Din, because we find in various places that the Beit Din can sometimes be called Elohim, okay, because they have a certain authority, and the name Elohim, according to rabbinic understanding, is associated with God's attribute of justice. So he's brought to the Beit Din, and presumably the Beit Din who originally sold him. And then what do? It says, V'higisha ala delet, they bring him near to the door, O elam zuzah, to the doorpost. And then his ear is pierced with an awl, I mean, for our purposes, a drill. And he will be a servant forever. And I want to point out, and here, if I am going to digress for one moment, I'm not digress. I'm going to actually deviate from what I did up to this point, because now I don't want to look at the rabbinic understanding, but at the pshat understanding. And the pshat understanding, if you look at page 2 in the Rashbam, reference number 5, the end of the Rashbam, the last line, it says, La'olam, lefia pshat, kol yemei chayav. La'olam means, as it sounds, for the rest of his life. So what I'd like to do is stop at this point and say, so what do we have here in terms of our section? We have a Jewish man who stole, who is not able to pay back. And as a result of that, the Torah prescribes in chapter 22, verse 2, that he's to be sold in order to pay back the debt. Okay, that's the only situation where a Jew will be sold as a slave. And then we have these very clear halachot. He's to be sold for 6 years. Automatically, in the 7th year, he goes out. There's no need for him to pay anything in order to leave. If he is single, he goes out single, okay, which means, again, I'm going now by the rabbinic understanding, the master has no right to give him a Canaanite servant for the purpose of being a breeder. If he's married, the master has the obligation to take in his wife and even his children, to feed, clothe, and house them. And it's in that context that the master has the, the right to give him a Canaanite slave who will bear children, and that slave and the children remain with the master, will always be his. And the last thing which we have is that this Hebrew slave has the ability to say, as he's about to be freed, just before he's to be freed, that I don't want to leave. I want to stay. And by the way, I'll just say, if the master is willing to agree to this, if the master is willing to agree, then he is brought to the court that originally sold him. They pierce his ear. And again, if I go by the pshat, then he will be a slave forever. Okay, that's our section. Now let's look at Vayikra, the middle section. Okay, this is Vayikra, chapter 25. And I didn't bring you the background, but maybe it's important to mention. The background is that chapter 25 begins with the laws of the sabbatical year. And then afterwards, they talk about the Jubilee year. And then afterwards, there are a whole series of verses which speak about, well, what if somebody becomes poor? And then he needs to sell his property, to sell, perhaps to take out a loan. And then we essentially come to the verses that I'm interested in, even though I gave you the opening verse that I gave you is verse 35, which says that if somebody is very poor, and presumably even after he sold his land, he still can't hold his head above water. So then what you do is you try to strengthen him, to lift him up. How? You give him an interest-free loan. What happens if that doesn't help? So let's look now at verse 39. Okay, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 39. Okay, any questions I will try to get to. First, let me get through the material, and then we'll come back to it. So, in verse 39 it says, if your brother should be poor, right? And yamuch is a specific word for being poor. It's like somebody who's falling apart, right? Who's literally being beaten down. And if your brother is poor among you, v'nim kalach, and is sold to you, lo tavod bo avodat aved. So the first thing which I want to point out is, it's very interesting that once again, we're talking about somebody who's now being sold as a Hebrew slave, except that this is a different situation. Someone who's sold because he's impoverished. Who sells him? So the answer is he sells himself. And notice that the Torah points out as it begins, this is your brother, right, who's now fallen, okay? And he's with you. And why is it saying your brother with you? Because the idea is he's somebody who really should be with you. And the word im, this is my interpretation, okay? You can hold me accountable, that in Hebrew you have two words, et, im. Itcha imcha. When you use the word im, it means somebody who's with you as your equal. When you use the word et, it means somebody who's subordinate. By saying your brother who's with you, im, it's saying he should be your equal. He should be with you. But what's happening is he's fallen down. He's fallen down to the point where he is sold. Okay, and it doesn't even want to say he sells himself. because that's really humiliating. He's sold. It's like, and it's as if he's a victim of his circumstances. Now look at what the Torah says. The first thing, Lo yimachru mimkeret aved. I'm sorry. Lo ta'avod avodat aved. When you work him, don't work him as a slave. So now look at Rashi. Rashi says, avodah shel gnai, work which is disgraceful, disparaging. Sheyehei nikar ba ke'eved, that's the type of work which only slaves would do. And what does that mean? So he gives two examples. Shelo yolich kelav acharav lebeit hamerchatz. He shouldn't be carrying your towels, whatever things you need, go to the bathhouse. V'lo yin'alo min alav, and he shouldn't be putting on his shoes. Okay? I don't know how much in our context that would necessarily be so problematic, but certainly in the context of the Talmud, right? This was the distinguishing characteristic of a slave, that the slave carries your clothes, he puts on your shoes, okay? And don't have this man do that. Now already maybe let's just look at the next verse. Verse 40, Mem. Kisachir kitoshav ye'imach. As an employee, as a hired hand, as a resident, he shall be with you. Ad shnat hayovel yavodimach. Until the Jubilee year, he shall work with you. Now again, notice the whole time, this emphasis on with you. And the whole emphasis is, in no way should he be treated as someone inferior. Treat him as your equal. Treat him as an employee, Okay? And what we're also told is, Ad Shnata Yovel, until the Jubilee year, he will be with you. Which means, and this becomes extremely important, that just as in the first case, there is a time limit which is given to how long this person is a slave. Over here, we're also given a time limit. That time limit is the Jubilee year. Now, let's look. Maybe let me say something now which I didn't bring here, which comes up, excuse me. When it says that he shall be as a servant with you, from that the rabbis derive that the living conditions which he has should not be inferior to the living conditions which you have. The food that he eats should be no different than the food that you eat, which means that in no way should he be given the sense that he is someone inferior. But in every way, he should be treated as your equal. Now let's look at verse 41. In the Jubilee year, he will leave you. Hu uvanavimo, he and his sons with him. Vishav el mishpachto, and he will return to his family. V'el achuzat avotav yashuv, and to the inheritance of his fathers he shall return. Okay, I understand Rashi says about Yovel. We'll come to that a little bit later. Okay, don't worry. I know that too. Okay, now it says in Pasuk Membet, Ki avadaihem, because they are my servants. Asher otzeiti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, lo yimachru mimkeret aved. Don't sell this person as a slave. And if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "What? How are slaves sold?" And probably as you have seen in various movies, where you basically put them on some sort of platform, right, on some sort of stone, and where there's an auction, there's a bidding, whatever it is. Don't do that when you buy him. And then the last thing which we have, where it says in verse 43, Lo tirdebo befarech, do not rule over him befarech. And I'm sure everybody realizes the word befarech comes up in chapter 1 in Exodus, which describes how the Jews were enslaved in Egypt. And what it says is, don't do that to him. Now look at the rabbinic comment, which Rashi brings. What is called avodat parech? So Rashi says in verse 43, Melacha shelo litzorech, work which is unnecessary, kedei la'anoto, in order to afflict him. Al tomarlo, don't say to him, Hachem li et hakos hazeh, heat up, warm up this cup for me, v'hu einot tzarich, and you don't need it. Ador tachat hagefen, okay, do, excuse me, what's the word that I'm looking for? Okay, when you weed, you when you're actually pulling up the weeds under a grapevine, and you say to him, okay, any type of work in the field doesn't matter, but do it until I come back, without giving him a specific time. The Shema Tomar, maybe you'll say, Ein makir b'davar. Who knows whether im letzorech im lav, whether I really need it or not. Therefore, and this person claims, I told him to do it because I really need him to do it. Therefore, it says at the end of the verse, and you should fear God. So let me just make one comment. According to the rabbinic understanding, avodat parech is either work which is unnecessary, or work which has no time limit. And I'll say this right now, it's essentially work which is trying to make the point, I am the master, you are the servant. You have absolutely no control over your time. You have absolutely no control over the purpose of what you're doing. I set the agenda for what is purposeful, for when it should get done. And therefore, the verse which I read to you previously, where it says, Ki avadaihem, they are my servants who I took out of Egypt. This is the key verse in this section. So again, if I could somehow summarize for a moment this section is talking about somebody who is poor, who comes to the point where he has no way of being somehow financially viable unless he sells himself. And in this section, there is no specific amount of time for which he is sold. And the point is, he actually can sell himself for any amount of time. There's no 6-year limit, but the one time limit is the Jubilee year. Whenever the Jubilee year will come out, it could be 2 years from now, it could be 50 years from now. But whenever the Jubilee year comes out, he needs to go free. The theme which is emphasized in this section is, do not in any way treat this person as a slave. In every way, he should be treated as your equal. To the point where the Torah even says at the end, and you should fear God. Because it might be that you will do various things and you will say that either nobody will see what you're really doing or nobody knows what you really intend, where in fact, the purpose of what you're doing is in order to enslave him. And ultimately, God knows, and God will hold you accountable. Now, note the fact that in our section, there is no mention of giving him a Canaanite woman and of breeding children. Notice also, which is very interesting in our section, it actually doesn't talk about his having a wife or not having a wife. It does talk about him having children, right? It talks about that he and his children will return to the family and to their okay, to their homestead. So I just want you to see how in each section, there is a different point of emphasis. And as I said, we're talking about two different types of Hebrew slaves. And maybe I'll say this right now. In our section, the point which the Torah is making, our section meaning Vayikra, the one I'm right now doing, in Vayikra, the Torah is saying, in no way is this person a slave. And in fact, if he's being sold as a servant / sachir, hired hand. And the Torah goes out of his way to remove any type of element that would say that he is a slave. That is not true in our parsha, in Parashat Mishpatim. In Parashat Mishpatim, there are two things that might, on some level, say, yes, he is a slave. The first, that the owner, under various circumstances, can give him a Canaanite slave to use for breeding purposes, and where by clearly emphasizing the children are not his, the woman is not his, that this is a reflection of the fact that, in other words, this is an expression of his enslavement. And by the same token, where he says, I want to remain, the Torah allows for that possibility, pierces his ear, which in this context is not a reflection of something positive, piercing your ear, but is actually seen as a symbol of enslavement. And the Torah, in its literal interpretation, says he will be a slave forever. And that is the characteristic of a slave. I'll just say this right now. A worker, a hired hand, is somebody who does it for a limited period of time. A slave is somebody who essentially is yours forever, where you control that person forever. So that in our parsha, although the Torah sets a time limit, and by doing that tries to somehow mitigate, him being a slave, but even by the fact that the Torah calls him an Eved Ivri, that already, is saying there's some element here of being a slave, and that becomes highlighted with the points which I made a moment ago. Whereas in Vayikra, the Torah goes out of its way to do everything to not treat that person as a slave and to look at them as a slave. Now let's look at the last section, which is in Deuteronomy, the one on the left. And I'll just point out that the beginning of the section, which I gave you, talks about staka. If somebody is very, very poor, then don't clench your fist, open it up, make sure to give them whatever they need, especially as the sabbatical year is coming to an end, and it might be that you lend them money, you won't get it back, but nevertheless, give them money, right? Because they are your brother. So now I want to look at the middle of reference 3, verse 12. Chapter 15, verse 12. It says, Ki macher lecha achicha ivri, if your brother, the Hebrew, is sold to you. Oh ha'ivriya, or a female slave, which, by the way, is the continuation in our parsha, which I didn't do. And maybe if I have time, I'll mention it a little bit later. So then it says the following, he shall work for 6 years, and in the 7th year, send him out from with you. Now, notice what's going on here. Who are we talking about? Now, given the fact that it talks about someone who sold for 6 years and goes out in the 7th year, presumably this section is referring to what appears in our parsha. And also the mention of the female slave is also what appears in our parsha, which I didn't look at. And yet, in this case, how does the Torah refer to him? It calls him your brother, the Hebrew, not the Hebrew slave. And the Torah also says, send him out from with you, which is the language that was used in Vayikra. He is your equal. So what does it say in verse 13? And when you send him out from with you, lo tishalchenu rekam. Do not send him out empty-handed. Ha'anek ta'anik lo. Okay? You should give him a ma'anak. In Hebrew, ma'anak is losing my Hebrew now. What can I say? In other words, you're giving him a grant. You're giving him what we would call severance pay. This is the basis for severance pay. Make sure you give him some type of severance pay. Mitzonecha, migornecha, miikvecha, from your sheep, your granary, your wine press, asher beirachacha Hashem lokecha, from whatever God has blessed you, titen lo, give him. V'zacharta ki eved be'eretz Mitzrayim. And remember that you were once a slave in Egypt. And God redeemed you. By the way, I'll add, which it doesn't say, but in the same way that before the Jews left Egypt, God told the Jews to go to the Egyptians and ask for clothing and silver and gold, which essentially was their severance pay. So that becomes the precedent. In the same way that God took the Jews out of Egypt and had the Egyptians pay them, you should do the same thing. And I'll just say, right, it's, no brilliant remark, that clearly the idea of giving severance pay is you're essentially enabling this person to start anew, to be able to get themselves on their feet so that they won't leave, right, without a penny, okay, as a slave, but they'll at least have the beginning, the initial basis for being able to assume a normal, quote, free life. And if you look subsequently, it says in verse 16, and if he shall say to you, Lo me'imach, I don't want to leave you. I love you and I love your house. Kitov lo imach, because he says, I love you because it's actually good by him. And you will take all the natatabos, no, uvadelet, lecha eved olam. And at that point, he will be to you a slave. This is the only time in this section where it refers to him as a slave. He will be to you as a slave forever. And then it says, and also to your female servant, you should do this. I'll just say, not that you pierce her ear, but that you should give her severance pay. And then it says at the end, Lo yikshe be'einecha, it shouldn't be difficult in your eyes. When you send them free from you. Because the work, the double work of a hired hand, he worked for you, and God will bless you in all that you do. Now again, because at the end, it refers to piercing his ear. And by the way, note the fact that here it doesn't say anything about the woman that he was given, and that he says that that he loves that woman. It's more that he loves the master, the framework, okay? But nevertheless, it does speak about piercing his ear, about being a servant. So all I'm trying to do is to say, clearly, the section in Deuteronomy is referring back to the section in our Parsha. And what it's doing, which is very interesting, is it starts out by saying, referring to this person as your brother, which it didn't do in our Parsha. He is somebody who is your equal, but it ends up when he says, I want to remain here, and it talks about piercing his ear, that's when all of a sudden we refer to him as being a slave. forever. Okay. So now, having said this, what I said, so what I'd like to do now is, I have the Rambam, but I'm not going to go through all the Rambam. You could look it up yourself, for your own reference. Okay, but what I do want to say is the following. Based on the discussion in the Talmud, the Rambam codifies la halacha, and Rashi agrees with it in his commentary. All the laws which govern the slave who sells, or maybe I should phrase it slightly differently, that there are many parallels between the two slaves, the one who is sold by the Beit Din for theft and the one who sells himself. And the parallels essentially are extrapolating from the one who sells himself to the one who was sold by the Beit Din. And what do I mean by that? In the same way that the Torah says by the one who sells himself, he should not be sold as a slave. He should not work as a slave. You should not have him do avodat parech. He goes out in the Jubilee year. All of those halachot, which emphasize he is not a slave, also apply to the one who's sold by the Beit Din. He's not allowed to be sold as a slave. He's not allowed to be worked as a slave. He goes out at the Jubilee year, if the Jubilee year comes before the end of his 6 years. Not only that, but what I mentioned to you, that he has to be given the same living conditions, the same food, that's essentially what we are told by the one who sells himself. And the halacha is, and that applies to the one who's also sold. So in that respect, they have all of these halachot, which are emphasizing he's not a slave. Where do they part? First of all, the one who's sold by the Beit Din has a very clearly defined time period, 6 years, and in the 7th he goes free. The one who's sold by the Beit Din, if he's married, the master has the option of giving him a Canaanite woman to breed children who will then be the slaves of the master, who will be Canaanite slaves. And the third thing is that in the case of the one who is sold by the Beit Din, he has the option of saying at the end of the 6th year, I want to remain, in which case his ear will be pierced and he will be a slave forever. But, and this was the question earlier, the rabbis, based on the other model, say you could never be a slave forever. So they interpret forever meaning until the Jubilee year. And therefore they say, no matter what type of Hebrew slave you are, you always must go out at the Jubilee year. Okay, I hope that whatever I've said so far is clear to everybody. The last thing, the last difference, is that the idea of severance pay is only given to the one who's sold by the Beit Din, because that's what Deuteronomy is speaking about. The one who sells himself does not receive severance pay. And I would just add, it's interesting that there does seem to be some type of link in that the fact that the master may have given him a Canaanite woman or has the ability to do so might also be connected with giving him severance pay and simply letting him go. Or maybe I should phrase it a little bit differently. Because as I've been trying to emphasize, by the one who's sold by the Beit Din, there is a certain element of being a slave. So that's why the Torah emphasizes when his time is up, let go. Do not hold on to him. and make sure that when you let him go, he's let go not as a slave, but not only as a free man, but as somebody who you're actually lavishing with all these gifts. Okay, so in the time that remains, so I'd like to first of all understand, and I hope I'll be able to get to this, why does the Torah actually split up the laws of a Hebrew slave in these different sections? And what I'd like to look at is how each model, each example is very much relevant in the context in which it's brought. And in that vein, I want to start with our Parsha. Remember, I said to you, our Parsha is chock full of mitzvot. And the first thing which the Torah wants to discuss is this idea of the Hebrew slave. And it raises the question, why? Why should that be the first thing that we talk about? And if you look at page 2, reference number 6, the Ibn Ezra. Look on the second line towards the end, which I have in bold print. The Ibn Ezra says, Ve'ein la'adam ba'olam yoter kashe alav. There's nothing that is so difficult to a person in the world, miyotor b'shut adam kamohu, than being in the domain, right? In the, I would add, possession of another person like him. Al kain heichel mishpat ha'eved. And that's why it began with the laws of a slave. Okay, so now, if you take what the Ibn Ezra is saying, right, he's the pshat person. The Ibn Ezra, if you look actually at the laws in our parsha, there are many laws which are brought down, which have to do with damages, which have to do with civil, criminal law. Essentially, they have to do with what we might call interpersonal relations, and specifically situations where people actually hurt their fellow man. And now, how does the court adjudicate the matter? And what the Ibn Ezra says, well, if we're talking about damages which were done to your fellow man, perhaps the greatest damage that could be done to somebody is for them to become a slave. And that's why we would begin with that, because this is the most difficult situation that a person can find themselves in. And there's a lot to be said for the Ibn Ezra, and I'm sure that all of us, right, who come from Western society, who've grown up with the ideals of freedom, right, who are sometimes champions of freedom, right? Presumably, this is exactly what we were brought up with. The idea that how could you possibly have one person who enslaves another person? And this is the most horrible situation that someone can find themselves in. And I would add to that, that's essentially the situation that the Jews, we experienced in Egypt. So I don't disagree with this, but I want to slightly turn it on its head. And I don't know, I think I mentioned it in one of our sessions. And if not, then for those of you who may be following me, I'm sure I must have said it in some context. You know, when the Jewish people left Egypt, so we talk about the Jews going from slavery to freedom. And I think I've mentioned that, but in a certain sense, that's misleading. Because essentially what the Jews are doing are replacing one master with another master. So instead of us being the slaves of Pharaoh, we become the slaves of God. Okay, we put it in nice terms, we're the servants of God. But essentially, right, in other words, here is God who's telling us what to do, pours on all these mitzvot. So why is it that one you call slavery, the other one you call service? Why is it one you call slavery, the other you call freedom? And the explanation, which I think I've mentioned, is because the question is, what is the intent of the owner, or what is the purpose of the situation? Is the purpose of the situation to denigrate me, to dehumanize me? Or is the purpose of the situation to empower me? In the case of Pharaoh, Pharaoh did everything to break the Jewish people, to dehumanize the Jewish people, to strip them of any sense of dignity. When God, quote unquote, enters into a covenantal relationship with us, which is the end of this week's parsha, the whole purpose is to lift us up, to make us a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests, to empower us, to maximize our human potential. Now, how is this relevant over here? And the flip of the Ibn Ezra? And I think I mentioned this also. Perhaps the Torah begins with the laws of Eved Ivri, and this particular type of Eved Ivri, because to what extent is it that sometimes we put ourselves in situations where we enslave ourselves, where we set ourselves into a certain process and certain path, which is ultimately degrading, dehumanizing. Now, again, think about the situation in our parsha where somebody becomes a Hebrew slave. They stole. Well, why are you stealing? Now, you could say, well, maybe they're stealing because they have no money. But if you have no money, there are other ways that you can get money. Get money where, first of all, it doesn't hurt someone else. Second of all, which is what we could call a more respectable way, more responsible way of doing it. But stealing is what we would call the easy way out. Then look at what we have in our section. What happens? Well, if you're married, so your wife comes in, and then what happens? You have somebody else who takes on the responsibilities that you should be taking on towards your wife. And then you're given someone to have babies with, who from the outset, you know, this person is not your wife. These children will not be your children. You've set yourself up to be put into a very degrading situation. But what's even more so, and that's what I want to highlight, what happens after 6 years and then you say, this is my wife, these are my children, but they're not. So what is it that makes them your wife and your children? And that's because you have all the benefits without the responsibilities, which means that what the Torah is doing by giving us the laws of Eved Ivri in our Parsha is presenting a model of someone who has what I would call a slave mentality, who enslaves themselves, puts themselves in a position where someone else takes over all of their responsibilities, where they're simply told what to do, and where from their perspective, they actually have the great life, because that person has to make sure to provide me with great living conditions, gives me a woman that I could have sexual relations with, who maybe I'll be attracted to, and then great, and I can have all the fun without the responsibilities. And then I have the option where theoretically I could say, you know what? I'd like to stay here forever. And here I want to say, there becomes a very interesting, in my mind, play on the difference between the pshat and the drash. When the Torah says that this person will be a slave forever, and the pshat is forever, it's because this person should be a slave forever. And it's because this person, this is what he really wants. because he is now looking for a life of slavery. When the oral law comes along, the rabbis say, no, that can't be. No matter what, you have to go out. It's as if the oral law is now saying to that person, you want to be a slave forever, we won't let you. You have to go out. You have to, no matter what, at some point, learn what it is to be a responsible individual. Let me add to this Vayikra. In Vayikra, we start off with a person who's poor. And no matter what they do, no matter what they try, they can't make it. And out of despair, they are selling themselves as a slave. From the Torah's perspective, they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't hurt anybody. They're a victim of circumstance. And that's why in Vayikra, the Torah emphasizes to the person who buys this individual, in no way treat them as a slave. If anything, do everything to lift them up. And I showed you earlier that before we get to that point, it talks about, well, what if the person was poor? Lift him up, give him a loan, don't take interest. The whole thrust of the Torah is when someone is all of a sudden in circumstances, which we might say in some cases are beyond their control, then it's the responsibility of the community to do everything to lift them up. In that context, the Torah, there is no piercing of the ear. There is no Canaanite wife, pseudo-wife. Because in that context, there is no element of slavery. Everything needs to be done to emphasize, to maximize the possibility of that person, as it says in the Jubilee year, going back to his family, going back to his ancestral heritage, going back to being an independent and contributing member of the Jewish people throughout all of its generations. Over there, it talks about his sons, because over there, it's talking about the sense of legacy, succession of the generations. And he needs to go back and play his role and hand that down to his children. Excuse me. So what I was trying to show you from these sections is the tremendous centrality, the centrality of being a free person, how important it is from the vantage point of the society to not enslave their fellow brethren, but I would say also from the vantage person of the person who might have the tendency to allow himself to be enslaved, to not fall into that trap. I'll just add something, food for thought, and I realize my time is over, so I'll just, but something to think about when we read these. And by the way, there are people, and I will say this at the outset, I'm not going to go into the idea of the Canaanite slaves. Okay, that's a whole discussion unto itself. I will refer you to the last halacha, which I brought by the Rambam, who says that even though there is a concept of a Canaanite slave, and even though there's an idea of doing avodat parech by a Canaanite slave, the Rambam says, even though that's the law, he says, but the quality of the chassid, of the pious person, the way of piety, and not only piety, but just being smart, is to be compassionate and to be just and to not be overbearing and to not be distressing. And then the Rambam goes and says that to feed and to clothe and to treat your slave as a member of your household, as a family member. So that even with respect to a Canaanite slave, there's the letter of the law, but there's the spirit of the law, which is even towards that person. The spirit of the law is they're a human being. Treat them as such. Treat them with dignity. Even if you have the right to do certain things, don't do it. Don't highlight, don't push the point. I am the master. But the point which I wanted to end is that clearly the laws of slavery are not at all operative in today's society. But I felt that it was very important to do this because the fact of the matter is, as much as we have progressed, there certainly are issues even in today's reality in employer-employee relationships. That to what extent is it not an employer-employee, but at a certain point, it really does become a question of enslavement. There's clearly a major issue in terms of sexual harassment, which appears in the marketplace. But even if I don't go to the point of sexual harassment, even in terms of having employers ask their employees to do things which are not within their job description, expecting that people will put in more time, which they don't get paid for. So that, and I would even add, and I'll end with this, to what extent is it that sometimes people, for the purpose of job security, because they're afraid of leaving a certain job and going somewhere else, might be willing to compromise themselves. And here I'm not talking about, which is an extreme example of compromising yourself, but I'm talking about even compromising yourself in terms of willing to take insults, willing to take, demands which are unreasonable, because that's what you need to accept, to be willing to bear if you want to keep the job. So that even if technically there is no slavery today, but nevertheless, there may be elements in today's workplace which we could learn a lot from in terms of the various laws which I've been trying to describe. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. If there are any questions, comments, I'm willing to stay for a few moments. So please feel free.
Thank you.
You don't have to feel obligated to stay, but if you'd like to, so we'll stay a few more minutes. Yes, so Allison.
So I had always wondered why, of everything, the first thing after Sinai and the first thing after we received the Torah, and it should be, such high level stuff, why would this come there? And now I see it's because to show the difference between what it means to be a servant of God and a servant, and a slave. Is that?
Yes, and I would also add, especially not last week's Parsha, but certainly the Parsha before, when you find that after the Jewish people are let go from Egypt, after they see all the miracles, and nevertheless you see the Jews saying at various times, this is terrible, let's go back to Egypt.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, wait a second, how could you possibly say such a thing?
Yeah.
And yet it's not so impossible. Because what it means is to be a free person, is to be able to deal with difficult situations, to take responsibility. And sometimes people are prepared to say, I'd like to take the easy way out. I think I mentioned at one point, many, many years ago, when I was doing my basic training, I was with a whole bunch of Russian Olim. This was in 1979. And at one point, this was a naive American who went to one of the Russian immigrants, who was a university professor in Ben Gurion. And I said to him, wow, I spoke to him in Hebrew, but this is the translation. I said, wow, isn't it great that you got out of the Soviet Union, you are now in the land of freedom. And then the response which I got was, I am free to die. And then this person went on to tell me how wonderful it was in Russia, that in Russia he received free education. After the education, he was provided with a job. He was provided with housing. He knew the language. He knew the culture. And all of a sudden, he's now being thrust into the situation where he has to all of a sudden find a job for himself, and he has to learn the language, and he has to learn the culture, and he has to pay rent, which isn't so inexpensive. So who needs freedom? Now, I'm not making, first of all, so nobody should take this the wrong way. This is not a statement about Russian immigrants. But what I'm just doing is taking one example, which I think is not so extraordinary, and which is illustrating my point that freedom is not something that you take for granted. Freedom is something that you have to work for. And freedom means that you have to take responsibility for it. And this is something which the Jewish people need to learn from the very outset. This is at the core of who they are, that they should never come to a situation where they will become a Hebrew slave, as outlined in the Parsha. Don't steal. Because if you steal, you might actually come to being a Hebrew slave. You might lose your dignity, but already with the act of stealing, you've done something to lose your. So don't compound it.
I suppose it could also apply to adult children who don't move out, who don't get, that they have to be done. Yeah.
Because it's much easier to stay at home. Why should I have to now go out and find, have to support myself? Absolutely. I was talking today with my wife about a certain situation, and she was saying also that, in other words, that a certain parent was doing a tremendous disservice to their child by keeping them, because in the end, the child has to become independent. They have to learn, and they thought they're protecting them, right? But they're not really protecting them. In the end, they're really doing a disservice. Yes, I saw that too. Yes, Alan.
Could any of these nuances be explained by a documentary hypothesis?
Theoretically, look, this is a big question. I personally have a serious problem with the documentary hypothesis, because I think that it's, anytime you find some problem in the text, it's very easy to say, well, it's AJEPD, whoever it is, and I think it's much more challenging. And I think, obviously, I also start with the assumption that the Torah has one author and that it's a unified thing. But I think it also prevents people from maybe looking deeper into the context and even the language. And that's what I was trying to do today, to show you that it's not just things were put in different places arbitrarily, but each place where it says it, there's a good reason for that. By the way, I didn't really go into Deuteronomy, but in Deuteronomy also, there's this whole feeling in Deuteronomy of the Jewish people, right, are going to be living in a reality which is very, very affluent. And then what it's saying is, but you're going to still have poor people with you. And when you have poor people, open your hand, okay? And don't say, well, everybody else is rich. Well, why are they poor? They're probably poor because they're, no goodniks. They don't deserve it. And it's my money. I made it, so I should keep it. And it's in that context that they then start talking about, right, the Hebrew slave, right, who stole and who was sold as being a slave. And then, what it says is, when the time comes and he says, and he needs to go, so don't say, I don't want to let him go. And don't say, you know what? He has a slave mentality anyway, so let's just perpetuate it. Let's keep him here. Let him go. And not only that, do everything that you can to try to get him on his own feet. He's your brother. He should be somebody who's your equal. So I think in each situation, that's my feeling. The more that you look into it, you see that there really is a depth to it and a logic. And therefore, I am very, very reluctant to, say it's just there were different authors at different times and that things were just slapped together.
Now here
I will just say my general feeling is that the authors of the documentary hypothesis have excellent questions and they have terrible answers.
Here it doesn't really apply. There are other places where the rabbis worked so hard to find It's an explanation.
When we get to those, we'll talk about it. Okay, anybody else? I saw there was another hand up. Okay, if not, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat
We'll
Shalom.
see you
Thank
next
you.
week.